Alabama has officially ruled that an IVF embryo is a child. And if you are in Alabama and you went through the IVF process and you had an embryo fertilized outside of the womb, even before it's implanted now, that embryo is considered a child. So there were three families, and it sounds like those embryos were accidentally damaged by a patient in a clinic. And because those embryos were no longer viable, destroyed, damaged, now the parents of those children, if we call it that, are able to sue for wrongful death of a minor. So this is a really interesting case. It definitely has implications on the abortion side of things, because we're now saying that because the embryo was fertilized, it's a child. Mike, would you call a fertilized embryo a child?
So I would certainly make a strong distinction at a certain point, and definitely underpinned a lot of the arguments within the case there. There were some embryos that were accidentally destroyed in the process, and it hinges on this whole concept of where does life exactly begin, because that'll then further dictate what charges would be, brought up against the IVF clinic where it happened. So you're exactly right. So the plaintiffs of this case are arguing that life begins at conception, and then they're arguing then that the charges that should be available to them would be a wrongful death. I would argue that it raises a lot of other legal conundrums that actually really complicate the whole in vitro fertilization industry, and to make it a lot more difficult for parents that are trying desperately, or rather people are trying to become parents desperately, to face a lot of legal obstacles, and sometimes these clinics don't even want to do business in the state because of the liability.
Well, that's what we're seeing now, is any of the IVF clinics in Alabama are kind of hitting the pause button and saying, hey, we don't really fully understand our liability now. We can offer this service to you individuals who may, they want kids. They're not able to conceive naturally. So listen, I think that when we talk about when does life start, it's always got this huge religious element into it. And I'll be the first to say, as right-leaning conservative, I'm not a very religious person, and I lose a lot of my support on my side when I say that, because I don't feel necessarily the same way that a lot of the people on the right do, where, okay, the embryo is fertilized, even though it's not in the woman's body, now it's considered human life. And okay, I think I'm going to take on the position that that is the case. And with that, I'm going to share a little video that I saw this week. It was a comedian, and he was making a joke about how this is always the battle. When does life start, at conception or not?
Did you hear about that woman who burned down the abortion clinic in Wyoming a couple months ago? She burned down Wyoming's only abortion clinic. It was 2 weeks away from opening, and she burned it to the ground. Now, she's being charged with a bunch of federal hate crimes because it was an abortion clinic. But her conservative lawyers are arguing, no. It was a construction site. It wasn't an abortion clinic yet. But the liberal lawyers are arguing, no, it was an abortion clinic. It became an abortion clinic the second they started building it. Which means we've got conservatives arguing that a thing isn't a thing until it's totally done, and liberals arguing that clinics begin at construction, and I feel like I'm losing my fucking mind.
It's a little funny anecdote, but it does underpin this debate where do you draw the line? And listen, I'm a new father. I have a 5-month-old now, and I will say this. I've always said that when I was younger, college age, if I were to knock a girl up, hey, available abortion would be a pretty good thing. I don't know if that I was ready to have a kid yet. Now I'm at a different point in my life, so I am. But I'm not the one to say it should be fully illegal. I've said it from week one, you and me, that we need to find common ground and we need to write single issue bills and legislation. But I think that the mission is not to solve this problem, right?
I have to agree with you a little bit there.
Sides. Yeah.
Sure. So I think we're kind of running up some issues here where I don't think a federal law is necessarily the best way to go about it. And that's not because I wish it wouldn't be that way. I wish it just would be a federal solution to it. I do believe in a right to abortion, but again, now this is public information. I am soon to be a father. I could say that abortion as a birth control measure is a bit reprehensible, right? As a society, we don't, I think anyone approves of that. That being said, then the further conversation could be, where do the afterbirth programs begin, right? Which takes up this heavy vested interest in, as to when conception begins. I would argue then, if we really have these family values, then let's follow up with some more, programs that help those single mothers. But I think one of the biggest issues here is that it creates this legal conundrum in Alabama, and to kind of go into a little bit more detail about why those clinics are, thinking about not operating there, because it also then affected my state. Ron DeSantis had initially expressed some possibility of them looking at legislation of in a court case of a similar nature in their state, having now retracted that position because they realize the minefield that it creates for themselves. Yeah. But what essentially happens when you create this exogenous conception, to be the legal point at which life begins, it then puts the care providers who do the implantation process as well as the fertilization process in a very precarious position, because you're dealing with patients who already have difficulty, getting pregnant to begin with. It's either hormonal or age-related. So these embryos, for one reason or another, may not be as viable as, say, some, a younger cohort population might be. So they might expire on their own just simply for those many reasons. And now it creates a situation to where any patient could then try to sue this clinic. And the legal liabilities just become so staggering at that point. Most of these clinics don't want to take that risk.
Yeah, I heard another point where it said that these fertilized embryos could also actually split into twins in some cases, or could become two children. So, you raise a good point. I mean, how can the IVF clinic, if the embryo is non-viable on its own and it dies in cryo freezing, that's not the fault of the IVF clinic. So I see what you're saying. And it harkens to this legislation that we've seen in Texas now, and maybe Florida as well, where the abortion is outlawed, right? And if maybe you can help me understand what it even is. I think it's that if somebody does an abortion, the people can get sued. I'm not even sure what the rule is.
That's correct. Yeah. So in places like Texas, it's very draconian, where you can get prosecuted, and then there's even situations where if you're an Uber driver, and maybe unbeknownst to you at all, if you transport somebody over state lines to a clinic or assist them in any way, they could be held liable for assisting, performing an abortion like that. So this is where I feel that policy just gets really kind of out of touch with common sense. And I think we're just kind of in an era where I don't know if there's a political appetite to find a federal solution to this, or even bring together a federal constitutional amendment. I think it's up to the states to really navigate that, as we're seeing here almost immediately. The Alabama legislature is bringing up a bill right now to help protect these IVF clinics who are threatened to leave the state and stop operating, and putting many of those parents or soon to be parents in jeopardy of being able to achieve their mission. So it's just fascinating to me how they're able to produce a piece of bill so quickly to fix this when there are so many other things that we really drag our feet on. It kind of lends to the gravity of the complications that were created from that ruling. But we kind of have to respect the process, right? So if Alabama wants to change that, they could either write legislation that adheres to that constitution in some way, or make some sort of constitutional amendment.
Yeah, well, I think they're also playing into some previous legislation, which was the wrongful death of a minor in Alabama specifically. So this ruling, it was an appeal, right? Because I think one of the families said, well, you've murdered our would-be child, and that's what their complaint is. So the issue becomes, when they were told by a judge originally, no, you can't really sue for this. It doesn't count. It's not. It doesn't make sense. And then the appeal said, no, actually you can. You can go forward with this, and it is. IVF embryo is considered the embryo. So, yeah, it's very confusing. I think that maybe people on the religious zealot side who are very, very pro-life, would they argue that IVF is like a demonic Satanist practice because you're not able to conceive naturally? I wouldn't go so far as to say that.
I wouldn't say that I've spoken to people who hold a more traditionalist or very conservative view on that. I would make the argument that IVF is really the families that, or people that are trying the hardest to be families. Yeah. To me, this represents the people who, despite all the obstacles, and to give you perspective, my wife and I went through just the fertility analysis, and we had potentially been afforded, freezing embryos or IVF assistance. That cost families anywhere between $30,000 to $40,000, and that was before the potential legal liabilities of it. So this is for many people who are very persistent to become to become a family. So it's very upsetting to see a potential financial and legal barrier then added on top of that. And then
it happens later in life, right? So a woman could potentially freeze her eggs to say, okay, I'm going to come back in 5 years. And now that opportunity has been taken away because these embryos were accidentally destroyed.
As you can imagine, the fear of some of those parents there who had their eggs frozen or were in the midst of processes and treatments, these clinics talking about having to shut down and where would my children go, and then if they're transported across state lines and they're considered children, it raises these whole, care and custody kind of situations there. So like I said, I think this is very much a solution in search of a problem that didn't really exist before. But it was absolutely a judicial test of when conception, when life begins, whether that's at conception or at some further along date.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I think of like overall conservative principles, we want to limit the federal government's power. And I do believe that's what turning over Roe versus Wade sought to do. It wasn't that Republicans necessarily, and I give them the benefit of the doubt on this, I don't think they necessarily had the goal of outlawing abortion federally, because that's not what they did. They had, I don't want to say they had the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court overturned this bad ruling because it was unconstitutional. So now, as a conservative, I believe in more power to the states. I think that overturning Roe versus Wade is great, and I think that those communities should make their own decisions. I live in the Northeast. We can go get abortions any day you want in all these blue states. Yeah. So why would somebody in New York, for example, in Manhattan, why would they have their representatives, or Elizabeth Warren is ultra loud about this, why are they able to tell you what's going on in Alabama or Oklahoma or Texas? I don't think they should be able to.
It's the same senator, who I had posted to my Instagram account some time ago, who was questioned about the ruling, and he had no idea the consequences of the actions, that was going to proceed from that. And it's someone who was arguing that this is a good ruling, it helps protect children and stuff like that. And then, again, there's the nuanced discussion. Well, it's like, yes, maybe conceptually the idea is that it's recognizing when life begins, but it actually creates these undue obstacles for people who are trying to create families. So I think it was very much just a social issue, and then obviously the left of center are going to capitalize on this. As I said in our last show, overturning Roe v. Wade was the best thing to happen to left of center politicians. It's just been an excellent both fundraising effort, as well as many of the reasons why Gen Z or other people become more engaged and have elected to vote Democrats in the last election.
Yeah, it's a rallying cry.
I think it's very troubling for Republicans, because this is where I feel that I almost align with conservative principles. I think there has to be some sort of just reasonable situation where people can decide on when abortion should be okay, and I think that's really ultimately the discussion between you and your medical provider, right? So if we want to take the government out of these kinds of decisions, I think that there should be more either amendments or legislation. Again, on the state level, it seems like is going to be the best approach now to really kind of, fulfill that policy.
I tend to agree. And the medical provider is probably the best person to make that decision, right? They understand the health implications of the woman. But as you kind of touched on, using it as a contraceptive is like low class. Like, we need to get more access to birth control or contraceptive devices, or more education for kids or young adults who are having sex. There are other ways, or as you kind of even mentioned, right, increase the access to adoption agencies or secondary care facilities, because of course that accidents are going to happen, and you're not 100% effective solution. So babies are going to happen when you don't want them to.
Right.
I guess I really don't like this topic, because you have to take a religious stance. I don't think that anybody on the right could really. Listen, I'm arguing your side. But
if you look at some of the supporting opinions for the decision by the Supreme Court in Alabama, it is dripping with religious morality, which not even just it being religious is my issue. I think fundamentally when we start legislating morality, it becomes very problematic, right? Because it's always whoever's in power gets to decide what are good or bad morals and stuff like that. So I think it's very problematic to choose that kind of authority and guidance on how you pursue those. So I think for many left of center people, we decide to look at it as more of like a very personal decision. Yeah. Again, I am pro-abortion in the sense that I pro-access. I am not pro-abortion as a method of contraception, but I like that you touched on some key things like how do we prevent abortions, right? I always say, well, what are the actual solutions to preventing abortions? The people picketing outside of the abortion clinics, I don't think have ever prevented a single abortion. I don't think you've ever changed anybody's mind by standing there day in and day out with a sign.
Well, they could have turned around one person, and I'm sure they would tell
all
you.
right, I'll concede. Maybe one person every blue moon or so.
If we reach one person with this podcast, then we've done our mission. And listen, that's what they would tell you. I'm telling you.
Fair enough. So I would make the argument then that we should choose more effective solutions that can actually intervene in other people's lives. So like you said, touched on contraception. And again, whether that's condoms, birth control, those are, again, decisions that you have to make in your personal life with your family, if when you're a minor and things like that. But abstinence programs, we know, are just not effective. But we know that education is probably one of the biggest deterrents of unplanned pregnancies, right? So just even getting people access to like a community college secondary education can, be the biggest detriment in an unplanned pregnancy.
Well, there is also a little bit of hypocrisy on the right when you look at the banning of certain materials that could be considered sexual health, materials. Right. I suppose if they're LGBTQ leaning, then you don't really have the risk of reproduction. But taking the health out of school seems to be a mission of the guys like Ron DeSantis. But at the same time, you want the people who have been successful with abstinence programs, the religious zealots. So it's kind of weird to find
the ones that have very huge families.
Right. Well, we want a federally illegal abortion, yet we want to return power to the states and make them decide. Yet we want to outlaw contraceptives and right. But then we want to ban abortion.
I can't square that circle either. I have a hard time with that one.
It's a dishonest conversation, and that's the exact crux of the issue. Is we now are going to head into November in a few months, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Who is the abortion or anti-abortion candidate?
Absolutely.
The other boogeyman is border. Those are the two things. Economy. Yep. They always say is like 80% of voters only judged by their pocketbook, and that's how they get the vote. I think an incumbent president wins like 90% of the time if the economy is in good shape when they rerun, or they'll lose if it's in bad shape. It's like the number one indicator. So
yep.
You see out of the Biden admin how they're trying to prop up all of their accomplishments. Oh, unemployment's really low.
Absolutely.
Gas prices are coming back down. Inflation's coming back down. But they don't say, oh, well,
it is very much a perception issue. So perception is obviously very much different from reality, but perception is incredibly important because it's what people base their decisions off. It's like you could tell me all day long how you're trying to combat inflation, but to many people it feels like you're being gaslit because it's like everywhere I turn, I don't see any kind of remedy in the horizon. Yeah. I will give some credit to Biden. There is a price gouging task force being put together, and actually a lot of it's centered around the late fees that you pay to banks. So they're currently set at $32, and the task force is trying to push that number down to $8. And just to give you a quick, a snip of the data over the last several years, every major bank has nearly doubled their stock evaluation, since that fee has gone up. So while, again, I'm not going to say it's causational, there is a strong correlation between these banks, bilking the small and middle class Americans, low and middle class Americans who can least afford it with these late fees, So I had to give some credit where it's due.
No, I need to ask you though. So have you paid late fees at your bank? I've never paid
once or twice, absolutely. So it's not me, but there's a large section of the U.S. population that does.
So this is my next question though. I get that the large population has maybe credit card debt, but a late fee to a bank, I don't even know what that is. How do you?
Well, that's credit card fees. So it's not necessarily overdraw, but it's these credit card fees. And again, it's just capping it at a reasonable amount. So this is where I think government has a place to play, is intervening on the behalf of Americans and the consumers, because we don't stand a chance against banks. Other than us writing new legislation, which again is just not happening in this political climate, I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't like the president, using an executive task force to get, it done, but I think Americans should appreciate, some checking on the bank's power in this regard.
I mean, listen, you use the word gaslight, not about this, but I will use the word gaslight about this, because this sounds to me like an excuse to talk about something that I don't even know who's dealing with this. The impoverished of the impoverished are maybe paying their late fees. I don't know. And listen, the other one that he did was hotel junk fees. Another thing, I've never paid this. I've never seen this. I stay in more hotels than most people. I don't really get it. Who are we doing this for? It's the same thing as we're going to forgive your student debt, or we care about the border and the Republicans don't. It's
forgiving
not real.
student debt, which is only federal student loans, which does contribute to only a small portion of the population. Absolutely, I think that speaks to the unfortunate, well, I wouldn't say unfortunate, I should say fortunate limits on executive power. The U.S. president doesn't have the power to, unfortunately, forgive all student debt. Yeah. I think that's a larger conversation to be had of some sort of, long-term refinancing, because I don't think that debt can be afforded to be resolved entirely by Congress. I don't think the American government can buy away student debt. Mm-hmm. But I think that with how many people that I know in my generation, and specifically my wife, who will be saddled with student debt for another 10 to 15 years, I think it would be extremely beneficial for American consumers to have that lifted off their shoulders. And again, some sort of debt restructuring, not necessarily just a blank check to get rid of it all.
Yeah, I am all for helping people, and if they're struggling and drowning in debt, I get it. I guess, though, and I made this comment maybe a week or two ago when we were talking about the war in Ukraine, how, okay, United States and NATO, we're keeping them afloat. So they are punching above their weight class, if you will. So is it possible, though, that somebody who goes to college who is potentially not able to afford it, goes and buries themselves in loans, and, maybe they shouldn't have gone to college. Maybe they should have taken a different route. And many times Absolutely. I feel like I shouldn't have gone to college. Did it help me? Yeah, it did. Did I not have debt? No, I didn't. So listen, I have to recognize my privilege.
Right.
But truth be told, listen, I don't think that the next generation is going to have the expectation or that path where every kid goes to college, because in our generation as millennials, they did.
I think you're touching on that key point, right? So there's a really good episode of Adam Ruins Everything, Adam Conover, controversial by some, but I do appreciate a lot of the work he does with that show. And he talks about the whole student loan issue. And for our generation, we had been told you go to school and you come out and you get a job. And we kind of wrote a blank check to the private and school industry to just say it's guaranteed loans, right? That you're either going to get FAFSA loans, or even if you weren't going to get a FAFSA loan, you were still always guaranteed access to some ridiculous 9 to 12% public loan from the just a public marketplace, and that's was absolutely unaffordable to someone. We went to Hofstra, right? I know lots of people who got either creative writing degrees or dance degrees. And I would think that Hofstra is probably not the best school to have spent that kind of tuition for. Yeah. When we were there, Cooper, this blows your mind. I just looked at it the other day. It was like $42,000 roughly when we were there per year. It's now $72,000 to go to Hofstra.
Per year?
What? Yeah, for what?
No.
I don't know.
Don't go.
Yeah. Honestly, best advice, go to either a community college or state colleges. That's why you pay your taxes. I think it keeps the cost of tuition in check, especially if you're from in-state and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's just the best route to not saddle yourself with debt unless there's some very specific private school that has a very specific program that you're looking to get into, and you have a very linear, absolute track that you have to follow. But yeah, absolutely do not just go to school because you want to go to school.
And absolutely, I mean, that's been like a joke almost on the right to say, oh, I majored in dance theory. What are you going to get a job in?
Yeah.
You may go end up on Broadway and you'll be, relatively successful, but that's very, you could also say you want to become a professional football player. Not everyone. I got an
anthropology degree, so I could teach the next generation of all these burgeoning anthropologists.
Right, and instead they're folding women's blouses at Anthropology, the store.
Yeah, exactly. That's what ends up happening. Yeah, Izan was stuck in the service industry afterwards for sure.
Well, hey, those jobs may not go away, but no, they will.
Yeah,
you
now they're
order
important
all
for now
online.
until robots take a hold of them.
Well, that's why you don't go to college. Maybe I'll tell my son he needs to go to a vocational school or go into a trade, because guess what? He's going to make just as much money as I am now, 10 years into a career, and he's going to make that in year 3. Okay.
Yep.
And
not
he
have to
won't
worry about
have
all that
any
debt.
right? Mm-hmm. And that's the essential worker. Being somebody who can actually go fix something, actually go build something, that's an essential job, as opposed to...
The construction industry right now is actually in an incredibly dire situation, because like the average age of anyone of like either mid-level management or higher position is like in the 60s.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I work with it.
Yeah, there's a huge dearth of younger people not entering the field, and it's becoming a problem because you need to train the next generation, because that institutional knowledge is going to be lost, and it's only going to be achieved by some conglomerate global contractor, right? So goodbye, small middle American contracting companies, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I was listening to something on the radio that was saying that the two supermarket brands, Kroger and another one, are looking to merge. And they're being held up by Congress to say this is antitrust because they're going to become a monopoly. And I'm thinking about it, at what level do you draw that line, right? Because they're competing against Amazon and Walmart and Target, which kill them on size. But now there's a barrier, right? There's a barrier to entry into the mega big box arena, because how could you do that? You have to build more Krogers. You can't support that. You need better systems, more diverse companies that are working together, right? And for me, it's just this government overreach. And it's the same thing that we're talking about with all these topics. We're trying to regulate our way into making these systems fair or equitable, dare I say. But the truth is that they're uplifting the oligarchy of the select few, right? Amazon is the technocrat of who is the best at shipping things to your door. No one's going to compete with them. So why are they not a monopoly?
Whenever you see any movements that either talk about trying to defeat minimum wage increases or just talk about what benefits that would be, considered a right to employees, it's the people who are behind it are really the largest corporations, right? They have the power to lobby and stuff like that. Right. So they're doing it because it gives them an undue advantage. They say, okay, well, if it has to be done that way, it's going to be done by these very difficult to reach regulations that a company of 5, 10, 20 people can't compete with a company of like 100 or even more like Amazon, right? I think you're kind of touching on the fact, right? We've lost control of a lot of these companies. Where do you draw the line? I mean, even Microsoft got hit with, monopoly busting back in the day, and I'd argue it really didn't impact their domination of the market, right? Yeah. There's only two really companies in that sphere anymore. So
now you have, actually speaking of Microsoft, you have this AI battle going on with who's going to become the best platform for it. And OpenAI was first to market and I think the biggest right now. But now you've got the Bing. I thought that was Microsoft as well, but there's other AIs and there's a Twitter AI. And actually Elon Musk just sued OpenAI because he jokes.
I didn't see that yet.
He called them closed AI. They started as a nonprofit, 501c3, and they wanted to, do good by putting out this system. And now it's become this, a joke almost to say they don't release their platform notes. They don't release their open
it's
source.
Privatized, yeah.
Right. And then it's become for profit. So it's not exactly what these original investors had set out to accomplish. So it's just
they realized how much money was to be made. We can't let that just go to market.
Well, exactly. It's another rat race to who's going to become the biggest, and
absolutely.
And that's why all this talk about regulation. So it's another partisan battle. But that brings me to what I wanted to also bring up, and we did some brainstorming on what we want to talk about, and one of them was partisan impeachments specifically, because there's been talk about impeaching Joe Biden all the time. There were 2 failed impeachments of Donald Trump. That's what I like to call them, failed, because he was acquitted of those.
Fair enough.
And then we can go even further back. In fact, you were helping me understand what was going on in the time of Bill Clinton. So
that's right.
That is, I think, where let's start by talking about Bill Clinton, and then we're going to end up talking about maybe even Mayorkas getting impeached now.
Maybe. That would be ahead of me. I haven't prepared for that one yet. But yeah, I'll give some context. So I'm going to make the argument that the Bill Clinton impeachment was partisan. It should not have been brought forth, but he should have been removed by office by the people, and they shouldn't have re-voted him back into the office, because he definitely did some very despicable things, and there was no question that there was problems with his integrity and character. But I think that the impeachment process was the wrong way to go about it, because then it dilutes the process. And I think that we failed to impeach Donald Trump on his first charge. And again, I just want to focus on the first one, because there's a second impeachment trial, which is worth a whole episode in and of itself. So we're going to focus on the first one. And I think because we don't impeach Bill Clinton, and it creates a very partisan process that leads to the inability to do it later, when I think we should have with Donald Trump.
So you're talking about the Ukraine impeachment?
I'm talking about the Ukraine phone call. Yep, not the J6. Yeah.
So So just help me out with Bill Clinton, just so everyone is on the
Sure.
same page here. He was impeached, but it was towards the end of his term, so he was technically acquitted, right? He wasn't ousted
He
from
was
office?
acquitted. So
Okay.
he was acquitted, yes. So it was a failed impeachment, if you will.
No, it was.
So yes, he was a. Yep.
But then he was elected
acquitted
again?
and had. Yes. Yes.
Oh, I
And
thought he was
actually-
out of office
yeah.
after that. Okay.
No. So this is we get Bush after him after his second bout in office.
Okay.
So it actually it
Yeah. The fact that it failed then laid the framework to say, you guys came after our Democratic candidate, we are going to come after your Republican candidate.
and then I argue it creates a process that elects somebody like George W. Bush, who I will go so bold as to say committed war crimes and dragged us into a completely unnecessary 20+ year war in the Middle East that we have little to show for it. And it was running counter to what was very successful intervention in the Middle East policies that his father had done, right? So I think we could look at the Gulf War as being incredibly successful, right? It was a very limited intervention. It was overwhelming force, so it ended the war very, very quickly. But it was a matter of protecting sovereignty, so we restored the sovereignty of Kuwait. And we didn't topple governments and spend 25 years trying to rebuild a government in a very corrupt, tribalistic, dynamic situation.
Yeah.
But anyhow, the Bill Clinton trial stems much to do with the fact that he was accused of obstructing justice and committing perjury, and that perjury has to do with his testimony during a civil case with a woman named Paula Jones, of which he claimed he never had any sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, who was one of the aides in his office, which, as we learned later by her own admission, not only at the time during the impeachment trial, but then later in detail, it was a considerable, I think 10 times that they had, sexual encounters. So I would argue there's two huge points here. We have this whole perjury concept, right? So perjury in and of itself is a felony. Right, so I think that does broadly fall under that category of maybe high crimes and certainly above misdemeanors, which is used in the language for what the articles of impeachment are used for in the Constitution. Right, it says that
100%,
the president and
yeah.
the vice president could be removed for misdemeanors and high crimes, things of that nature. So I would actually say that it wasn't perjurous because it was in a civil suit in which he never was convicted on the basis of lying, right? So actually the Paula Jones case was settled out of court, and the only charges he received thereafter were simply civil contempt charges, right? So I think that doesn't rise to the level of misdemeanor. However, it makes for really good ammunition to try to get Bill Clinton unelected because the accusation was that he was asked, an Alabama state trooper, Arkansas, let me clarify. An Arkansas state trooper asked Paula Jones at the time to meet Bill Clinton in a hotel where he exposed himself and was under the impression that, there was going to be some sexual encounter between them. So again, this is not to let Bill Clinton off the hook, but the trial that stemmed from that, Paula Jones, her case was thrown out because the judge found that there was no case for the damages that she was claiming. Again, this civil trial that Paula Jones brings up is brought up by two conservative lawyers, one of which is a prominent, conservative radio host who takes to the airwaves immediately. And it just so happens that this trial is brought 2 days before the statute of limitation exhausts. These two lawyers were asked to be dismissed from the case by Paula Jones they asked to be dismissed from the case because Paula Jones didn't want to agree to the settlement. The lawyers were willing to agree to a dollar amount on contingent that Bill Clinton didn't have to apologize. And she was less focused on the dollar amount. And she's like, I just want Bill Clinton to actually apologize for getting a state trooper to ask me to show up at a hotel, naked and expecting sex from me, right? So again, very crazy situation, but she waited way too long to then press charges after it, which again ties into that culture of why, we should be more forthcoming.
So then you'd have a large problem with the settlement for $83 million to E. Jean Carroll, right? Because they extended the statute of limitations. It was well outside.
Yeah, I would have issues with extending statute of limitations like that, right? Because that kind of bends the purpose of the court and the original intent of the law of when you could prosecute somebody.
I mean, that lady
alone.
She went on MSNBC and was joking with Joy Reid and Rachel Maddow saying, yeah, the New York extended it for me. They did it for me so I could press charges against Trump. Like that's partisan. Excuse me.
I think so too. Sure.
So you said that
It certainly sounds like it. Yeah.
You said that the civil trial was ultimately thrown out.
Dismissed.
I guess. Okay.
Yeah, it was dismissed and settled, right? So this civil suit was settled, and ultimately she never got her apology. And then thereafter, it was reduced even further for like some amount that went from almost $500,000 down to less than $90,000, of which most was lawyer fees that were paid to those two conservative lawyers. So she got almost nothing out of it, and she didn't get her apology out of it. And the judge had awarded that, you hadn't shown or demonstrated any evidence that Bill Clinton's, your experience in that moment with Bill Clinton had caused any damages from it. Yeah. So again, I don't want to discredit that Bill Clinton wasn't being a total POS. I'm just saying that it seems like the trial, to wait almost 7 years after the fact, or I'm sorry, 3 or 4 years after the fact, 2 days before, and it's prominent conservative lawyers who want to potentially unseat him from office, right, and make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
So now, like I said, this is where it gets iffy. During this trial with Paula Jones, regarding Monica Lewinsky, and this is where people will say the perjury comes in, is because Bill Clinton, being the lawyer that he was, would dance around what is means, things like that, right? So they were able to demonstrate in this trial, the impeachment trial, that his understanding of sexual relations only included sexual intercourse and not oral sex, of which there was, 10 accounts or more at least. Yes. So again, extraordinarily preposterous. But they were able to demonstrate to the court that day and to be able to get, I think it was at least 5 Republicans and then 10 the other time, to be able to defeat a majority vote that would move to convict him on those impeachment.
Yeah, I guess, though, so when I think about the Trump trials and the impeachments and tie it back to what we're talking about here, there's no question that this is partisan process. I mean, there's every expectation that these impeachments are not going to pass because of the two houses of Congress. So I guess what's come up a lot in conversations when I kind of debate whether or not Trump is guilty of insurrection, which has been all over the top of mind right now. So one thing that people on the left always say is that an impeachment is a political process. It is not a criminal process. So to say that he was acquitted of the charge in an impeachment does not acquit him of the charge in a criminal court. And that, to me, has always been really confusing, because how are you going to go through a process to indict a president, get him in trouble, go through investigations, go through oral arguments, and then all of a sudden it fails and you go do it again because you have a partisan judge?
I'm glad you brought that up. Because when Bill Clinton leaves office, right? So there was he had to settle with the Arkansas bar, and actually he was disbarred for 5 years because of his he was held in civil contempt, like I said, at that Paula Jones trial, right? Which was ultimately determined to be misleading testimony. And it was because of around that Monica Lewinsky thing, when it ultimately came to light that he was clearly, misrepresenting certain facts and playing on the idea that, well, when you said sexual relations, I thought you meant only sexual intercourse and not oral sex, even though it has the word in it, right? So I think it was...
You know what?
So, but it was a key distinction.
Blame the lawyer on their side for being ambiguous.
Absolutely. Well, that's my point, is these were scummy lawyers, right? They were willing to take a settlement without an apology. If anything, I think like if you were, determined to prove a point, they should have settled for that. But like I said, it proved that even though there was a lot of concerns during the administration, Bill Clinton's administration, of trying him while he was in office, the moment that he did leave office, he did have to face some consequences for that, demonstrating that there is no immunity, during your actions while you were president. Right.
Well, I don't want to go and use that word immunity because it's coming up, currently with Trump and whether or not he can order the assassination of his political rival while in office and get away with it. So I think maybe the double jeopardy is maybe the better way to say that, right? You avoid...
Fair.
It's not relevant in this case, double jeopardy, right?
So I make a reference because of this, because when Julius Caesar was trying to, gain control of Rome, it was right before the Civil War. The issue was when you were consul, which was essentially the not quite dictator, but it was more or less our president of the time with a lot of other different stipulations. But in the Roman Republic, the consul was a position that when you were held, much like we adhere to today, because this is where our legal jurisprudence comes from, while you're consul, you are immune from any kind of legal or civil challenges. You do essentially have, dictatorial powers, but it is only for 1 year.
Right.
So while Julius Caesar leaves his consulship, he goes out and he conquers Gaul. And his whole objective is that when he comes back, is that he needs to try to make sure that he gets elected as fast as possible. He's rushing back from what is modern day France to Italy, when we had to march on our feet, because he needed to make the consulship and get elected, because if he didn't, his political rivals were going to put him in jail and exile and things like that. So there's this one moment that I really think is it kind of epitomizes some of my feelings that happens around the Trump administration. It's called the crossing of the Rubicon, and the Rubicon River was this river that divided Italy from the rest of the European continent, and there was this tradition that no general ever, when they walk past that line, can have a mustered standing army, right? So it was a kind of a ceremonial process that you would disband your legions as soon as you came up to this marker. And Julius Caesar is noted as, crossing the Rubicon in this moment, because he takes his legions with him into Rome. And it's kind of like, once you set that precedent, you can't unset a precedent, right? So that's what, potentially sets off future civil wars and things like that.
Interesting. I wouldn't have known that's where crossing the Rubicon comes from, but I get it now. I mean,
it's a great
listen,
book, by the way. I would recommend.
Yeah. So hey, you came out and you say that you believe that Clinton should have been tried harder for lying, but wasn't. Am I characterizing that sort of correctly from what your position would be?
So I would say that he should have been judged for lying by the people. He should have been judged by a court of a public opinion, because as you described, right, like this impeachment process, unfortunately, it doesn't lead to any criminal conviction. So we could find that he was perjurious or that he obstructed justice, but it really does then come on the following Justice Department to, follow through on that, which it's generally been a policy not to persecute rivals, to kind of bury the hatchet and promote a peaceful
now they do this special
transition power.
counsel's election and all that stuff, which is
Well, unfortunately, we're kind of getting past that. So I would argue is that Bill Clinton lies, but we don't know about that until after the fact, and he uses very clever legal proceedings to make it very difficult to work out intent, right? So that's what's about perjury, is that you have to demonstrate that their sworn statements align with their intent of their actions, right? And unfortunately, the sleazeball that he was very good at, covering up actions, getting people to speak on his behalf, using very carefully worded statements, then to go off on a digression about what is actually means, right? Things like that. So I would argue that, go ahead.
No, I want you to finish, because you're about to characterize. So then I'll respond with my thoughts on Ukraine.
So I think that he doesn't demonstrate obstruction of justice in the same levels that I will argue in the proceeding that Donald Trump does in the phone call controversy with Ukraine.
So the phone call controversy, let me just try to summarize this. So there was this guy, Victor Lindemann, and he was aware of this phone call, or was able to listen in because of his position in government. And the phone call was between the current Zelensky, current president of Ukraine, and Trump. And essentially the conversation was, there is corruption in Ukraine. There is collusion going on with Biden. He came and he said, fire this prosecutor. They were investigating Burisma, and he got fired. And there's this tape of Biden saying, we're going to hold back your aid unless you fire this prosecutor. And what do you know? Sure as shit, the prosecutor was fired, as Biden says. So what they accused Trump of was withholding aid until an investigation into corruption was done, and called it quid pro quo. The people on the right of the aisle said Joe Biden withheld aid in exchange for investigating and firing the corruption, or not investigating the corruption, is, and you can argue both ways, but it's almost the exact same thing. So this is, in my eyes, the definition of what a partisan persecution for political reasons would be. They knew that the Republicans at that time controlled the Senate. There would be no impeachment that would happen. He would remain in office. It was a guaranteed fact. And it also played into the fact that we were in the the government was in the process of making Russia out to be this huge boogeyman all the way back to 2014 still, since Crimea was annexed and since Obama was in office. And then when Trump comes in, we've got this big story in 2016, Russia interfered in our election. We've got to be afraid of Russia. We start doing this Mueller investigation, which took years and years, I think $43 million in resources, all to come out with this one little soundbite that says, no collusion, no obstruction. Donald Trump is off the hook. And then you come out with the Durham report, and that one didn't get nearly as much press coverage, but I believe had more credibility. And it explained that there is no validity to this whole Russia collusion hoax. It is exactly as Donald Trump described it, made up by Hillary Clinton and Obama sitting in the office together while there was an ongoing presidential election and campaigns going on. Like, to me, that is insane. That is like, wow.
I definitely have some different interpretations of a few events, and there's a key timeline that I definitely want to get into that I think kind of demonstrates a more sound and demonstrable case of obstruction of justice, in my opinion. So
for Russia and Mueller, or for Ukraine? You'll lay it out.
No. Sorry. So to give it context, it's specifically around this phone call that occurs between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, who was recently elected at the time in Ukraine. And yes, it was specifically hinging around this idea that Trump was withholding aid, and then it stems on that whole quid pro quo, and that's Latin for kind of like do something for me and I'll do something for you, or favors. Oh, there's a few different ways you can interpret it, but that's more or less there's an expectation, right, of some of the negotiations that you're going in, and I will say that. Yes, the collusion, it wasn't as if Russia and Trump were working together, but I will paint a picture that shows that there were very shady people that were riddled throughout not only his campaign from the get-go, but then eventually his administration. And this is where I think that, unfortunately, to Trump's discredit, is he aligns himself with people who create these dilemmas and situations for him. And that's why, for me,
names?
I am definitely going to name... Yeah, Manafort. Yep, that's the first one I'm going to get into. Yeah, so that was a bit concerning, right? So he did not disclose that he was taking, funding, and that he was actually a, consultant and an international lobbyist, right? So there was the campaign financing issues, right? So he was taking money that he was given and not reporting, I think, to the tune of a couple $1 million. So he had a lot of unpaid taxes. There was lots of shell corporations where he was hiding this money. So it demonstrated a significant, set of events that he was, going about trying to hide this, right? So he ultimately is charged for this. And coincidentally, he is also at the same, just before he becomes the Trump chairman of his campaign, he consults for the then outgoing president of Ukraine, who was ousted because of alleged corruption charges, right? So this is where it gets really tricky. This is the president who then flees to Russia and starts this whole delegitimacy of, their revolution, and then whether the Donbass region, and I forget the other name of the other one, belongs to Russia because of the ethnic alliance, right? So this really stems from way back when Paul Manafort, right? So then I also want to bring into Rudy Giuliani, right? So this is where it's really important to bring him into the picture, right? So since at least May 2019, and this is before this July 25, 2019 call, right? So this is to give you some context, right? So May 2019, Giuliani, we have him on record many, many times, is pushing President Vladimir Zelensky to investigate Burisma. There's no doubt about that. Says it in his tweets all the time. Goes on talk shows. This is the administration's biggest platform. Is the reason why they're doing this is to investigate this Burisma corruption.
Correct.
Now,
which in theory is a good thing. Can we agree to that?
Absolutely. I think investigations are fine if they lead somewhere and they're not politically charged to try to dig up non-existing evidence on the expected rival of the next presidential election.
Oh, gosh, you're saying my talking points the other opposite way. But listen, Ukraine was widely accepted as like the most corrupt nation.
It scores very low. It's not the most, but certainly scores lower than places like Saudi Arabia, right? That has certain corruption issues. So there's no doubt with issues of corruption, and those corruption issues are mainly, and I'm going to argue, is from Russian influence in their politics, right? You see it all the time. There's Russian oligarchs. Unfortunately, they have a shared cultural heritage, right? Many of the Ukrainians speak Russian, so not too long ago, these people did just see themselves as both Russians and Ukrainians. They were all part of the Slavic, peoples. So a lot of this corruption is USSR cultural era, corruption, and that is what the Obama and then the Biden administration tried to, change. And that's, again, we could say it's escalatory and whatnot, but the idea is then to create a non-Russian aligned, state that we did promise NATO membership in 2008. To get them there, it would be very helpful if we could, deal with some of that corruption and get rid of some of those individuals. So one of the individuals who is the prosecutors, as you had mentioned before, yes, the Biden administration wants him out. Again, the chief criticism of him is that he's not prosecuting people. In fact, he goes to make the accusation that he has a list of people that he was given by the Biden administration to not prosecute, right? So he's like, these are people that should be protected from these corruption inquiries, right? So he says this on record, and the State Department of the U.S. says bullshit, right? And nothing ever came from that, right? So very much sounds like someone's trying to, protect their hindquarters a little bit there.
Yeah,
and,
but
and,
I
and make
would
these
argue,
bold accusations.
I would argue it's our federal government that's probably trying to run roughshod over this argument, right? That's the talking point from the left, from Europe, from the Biden administration to say, no, I think Poroshenko was his name. No, we fired him because he wasn't sufficiently investigating corruption. But that's like runs exactly counter to what the guy himself said. I was about to do Burisma and I couldn't do it. So, right, that's where I'm like.
And again, a lot of this stems from this Rudy Giuliani push. So I will circle back to that. But I would say that these investigations are so narrow and focused on the alleged actions of what will soon be his political rival, that it's so narrow. And again, I'll get into some more of the particulars here. So Giuliani now, again, someone making lots and lots of claims, has sworn statements from 5 different Ukrainians that allegedly were brought into the White House during the Obama administration, and then he got these statements to go dig up dirt on Trump and Manafort, allegedly by the Obamas, but he was never able to provide these sworn statements ever again, right? So if these were affidavits, I think that would be a really important thing to bring forward in a court of law. If you have extraordinary claims, you got to have extraordinary evidence, right? So if you're, and again, I will give a lot of credence. If we go to the Office of Ethics, and I forget the name of the actual department, there is a lot of very questionable payment transaction records of Biden's, Hunter Biden specifically, of Biden's time in Ukraine. No doubt about that. So like I said, let's look at this investigation. But I'm trying to figure out where there's any more situation other than Joe Biden just being in the room, or Hunter Biden saying, my daddy's, going to be upset if you don't, stay committed to the deal that I thought we negotiated. Right. And to me, I find that just as troubling as like what Eric and Donald Trump Jr. do, right? Like, I can't imagine what kind of leveraging power that you have in your negotiations when you could say, well, my father, is the president of the United States, right? So like, think about the advantages of doing business with us. So I want to be very clear. My standard is, I have integrity here, right? It's consistent. So I find those as concerning. Where I find the obstruction of justice start to arise is we have all these instances of Rudy Giuliani. We have him dating way back when of him making these accusations, but he can never bring physical documents forward, right? Sometimes there's these payment records, but they're never really smoking guns and stuff like that. So, and a lot of it has to...
Just for the timeline, what year are we in, roughly? Like 17, 18?
We're still in 2019 I'm talking about, right?
Oh, we're in 19. Okay. So Rudy has the laptop in 19. So does the FBI. And people think that he got it from Russia, which I think is BS. I think that the laptop owner
Hunter
probably
Biden
contacted.
left it.
Yeah. So
Hunter Biden left it.
That's what I mean. So
I don't know.
It's a talking point to say that Russia tampered with it or gave it to him. I don't buy that, and that's what everyone says. Oh, it was tampered with. It's all made up in file folders. BS. No, it's a real laptop. They confirmed the Google Gmail codes on the emails. It's real shit. So the issue that I have with those...
So this is the thing is... Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say the argument on our side would be that, or on the right, would be that Biden is out there selling influence. He's collecting checks through Hunter, through shell companies, and it's ending up in the Biden family name, whatever. Maybe it's transferred to Biden, maybe it's not.
Absolutely.
But he is making decisions from a position of power to impact these other countries. Now, Okay, you got Jared Kushner going out there to Saudi Arabia. What have we done for Saudis? I don't think we've done anything. Trump didn't do anything, right? Did we give him anything?
I think that's the problem is they didn't get anything done. Remember those grand promises of this alleged peace deal, and here we are, right? So I would argue, right, that's my whole concerns, right? And I'm not going to, we can go into the weeds about accusations, but there's never been charges brought or anything like that. So I don't want to say what the Trump children did or the fact that there was, like the operating business across the street. We do know that there was something like $750,000 from foreign dignitaries that were spent there. So again, it's just as concerning in my regard. But again, I want to frame this as Rudy Giuliani, many months before this, and again, his timeline is very important. So before this July 25 controversial phone call, Rudy Giuliani, on record, we have record of these phone calls with these dignitaries, which is very strange too, because Rudy Giuliani was never like an official member of government. So
Right.
his extrajudicial position was very odd, and I think is represents questionable powers that you can give to just a civilian in that regard.
I'll give you
just on
that,
the name
yeah.
of there being counsel.
For sure.
So we have him on the record saying Zelensky would have a much better relationship with Trump if we were to start opening up some of these investigations, right? And this is just one time where we have him on record. He is then, on his tweets and talk shows many times before and after this saying, there needs to be something done. We got to do something about this. We have from the get-go Zelensky coming into office, many of the Trump administration before the official talks happen, pressure on to investigate Burisma and things like this. So to me, the motivation's set. There is clearly a desire to get this investigation started on Burisma. We have so many levels of not only the Trump administration, but we have like Trump himself that will then go on to this phone call. And I don't hold me to the fire of this, but I think the Biden withholding funds was not congressionally allocated. And again, don't hold me to that because I'm not 100% sure.
What would be the distinction of that? I don't understand.
The distinction is that there is roughly $400 million of the funding that for the Ukraine that was specifically allocated by Congress.
Oh, I
that
see. So
means
this
that,
would have been extra on his own slush fund.
Yeah. So I don't know if it was a discretionary budget that he actually had control of. So don't hold me to the fire. I might be wrong about that one. But what makes the Trump one so to me a demonstrable case of quid pro quo is that this is congressionally activated funds, right? So if we're going to respect the balance of powers, Congress makes those decisions through legislation, not an executive, making a unilateral decision on then how the budget is allocated. That disrupts the flow of government tremendously. So
I can see with what you're saying, but I guess I would argue that Trump just has this very conversational way of speaking, and he almost is a storyteller.
Gets him in trouble.
You can't not do a quid pro quo the way that you tell a story in that way. But then therefore, you have to include those things if you're a storyteller. I don't know. I got to defend Trump a little bit.
Sure.
So here's what I would ask. We talked about Rudy Giuliani, and we talked about the motive that we need to reopen investigations. It's against our political opponents. Okay. Rudy Giuliani was known as America's mayor. He really cleaned this city up, New York. He did. So
he's really fallen far, I would say.
Right. Okay, so he had everything to lose, right? Did he think that he was going to become some celebrity type where he was in Trump's stratosphere? Because is that what we're saying was his motivation?
That would be my opinion.
I would say that he had everything to lose. If he just shut his mouth, he would have been great. He sent 2 emails. Here's the laptop. Don't talk to me. Don't hear from me again. Okay.
I mean, that's quite possible, yeah.
He runs his podcast still. I don't watch him. He's on freaking Newsmax. He's got a program. Okay, I see him on Instagram Live every day, and I don't ever click it. But what he does post all the time when you scroll your feed, you'll see the election was stolen. The guy got charged, what was it, 100 and something million to Ruby Freeman and her daughter. And guess what?
Yeah.
The guy is still out there saying that the Georgia election was stolen. So I have to think that there's some merit to the claims. He's not just gonna, dude. He threw away his whole life. Like, you know what I mean?
I mean, when you dug your grave, where else are you gonna go? I mean, let's just say, what is there any scenario where he could say, "Oh yeah, no, I was totally wrong about all that stuff," and not be completely excoriated, right?
To be
literally
fair,
crucified
right?
in the court of public opinion.
Right? You don't know her, but Jenna Ellis is a perfect example of that. She was one of the ones who was fighting election integrity, saying the election was a hoax, and then all of a sudden she gets charged in the Georgia case, and she's the first one to say, everything I said was a lie. I'll be your witness. Don't worry about me. Meanwhile, she's got 1 million followers on Twitter, all right-leaning people. no matter what she says on Twitter now, there's 1,000 comments. You're a fucking traitor.
Of course.
You took $300,000 for your legal fund, and then you just pled guilty. Give it back. And that's very scummy. But so people like that, and then people like Release the Kraken. You know who I'm
Sidney
talking
Powell.
about. Sidney Powell. Right. They've completely
well,
reversed course.
She's involved in this story. Yep.
But that's my point, is these people had nothing to gain. Nothing. They were not going to become... I guess
I
maybe
would argue
they would,
had,
yeah.
They had everything to gain because no one knew who they were before this, right? So Rudy Giuliani, I would say, fallen very far out of, relevant circles and stuff like that. I was trying to look up how many people had left the Trump administration while he was in office. I mean, the number is unfortunately too staggering. I would waste the rest of the time of the show just listing them all, but I think it's a revolving door of people trying to capitalize on it or feel that they could be the guardrails on democracy, and maybe I can get Donald Trump I can align him to, deregulate some of the economic sector, which, is typically, Republican values. So I could see people's intentions, but I would argue that maybe Rudy Giuliani's intentions were good, and he just did himself such a disservice by falling down this rabbit hole and chasing these theories. And then more importantly, he associates himself with these people called Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. I don't know if you probably aren't going to know those names.
No, I listen to Lev Parnas on Twitter Spaces a lot.
They eventually are gone on to being convicted for tax evasion and stuff like that. Similar deal as Paul Manafort, structuring lots of shell companies and stuff like that. So they're also the ones who are some of the prime testimony for Rudy Giuliani about this bereavement investigation and General Biden corruption investigations and stuff like that. I'm going to paint my partisan picture. I say what's going on here is that Obama and then eventually the Biden administration are doing things to clean up that corruption. And there's people who don't like that because they benefited greatly from that corruption. And now we have too many people, like not even just Paul Manafort, we have like Michael Flynn, who are very sympathetic to a view or that would allow, Russian dominance of that particular sphere of influence, right? We see Michael Flynn, who is heavily involved in the Trump campaign and espousing for either the corruption in Ukraine or not getting ourselves involved in there. He's seen 2 years before he takes office in the Trump administration after his appointment, he's seen sitting next to Putin at a dinner, and he took $45,000 to give a speech about leadership to the Russian intelligence agency, which is like the equivalent of our CIA. If that doesn't sound extraordinarily troubling, I don't know what does, right?
Yeah, but again, we're with a frame of mind that Russia is like hacking us, subverting us, ruining our democracy, and I don't subscribe to that school of thought.
What better way than to influence a former excuse me, I can't remember his service, but he was heavily involved in counterterrorism.
Yeah, he was
for
like
many years,
like a 4-star general. The guy was in the NSA, probably. He's like the top of the top.
He was kicked out by during the Obama administration because of his sympathies towards the the Crimean situation in favor of kind of a Russian, hegemony in that area.
Could I just make an assumption, though, that a person that went overseas and served and spent their career in public service in war and watching young men lose their lives and people dying on a battlefield because they're shot in the face, this is why maybe the man is saying, hey, we're going to lead to 1 million plus deaths. Here we are, and maybe we can avoid
he wants
this.
He wants to be very tough elsewhere. So I don't think that's the issue. To me, is it screams someone who's been disenfranchised because they were pushed out by Obama, and he has this chip on the shoulder to then take it out on the Biden administration. Because for all intents and purposes, it's the Obama administration 2.0. It is very much Biden's particular touches to the recipe, but it is the same brand of centrist establishment, Democratic politics. So my opinion is that Michael Flynn and people like Rudy Giuliani are people who got pushed out of the circle because there are many other prominent generals that disagreed with them wholeheartedly, right? It's a matter of when you're a president, you need to put people in some places in your administration that you feel that are giving you good advice. Some people are there for a long time and you trust their opinions, and some people you don't, right? So in that case, right, we're going to look at the Trump administration. He does this wildly. So, and I think there's some key timelines to where the people who are responsible for reporting this whistleblower comment are taken out of power. by the Trump administration. I would argue then that they later do not file this whistleblower complaint within the timely 7-day requirement by the law, because he was pressured by the White House administration. And then this is the Trump administration. And then shortly thereafter, he is replaced with someone else who is much more favorable to this, an interpretation that would be beneficial to Trump.
But all what I would say, though, is that we're talking about, right, and I'm glad that we're talking about their personal motives, right, whether or not they're going to try to seek to gain celebrity status.
I do want to get to the facts.
Yeah, but I could see that too, and I concede. I could see that argument that Rudy saw that writing on the wall. But what I might do is turn that on its head and say, this freaking guy, Victor Lindemann, is a career bureaucrat who's never got his name out there. He's worked in this contentious area for his whole career in Ukraine and Russia. And guess what? Now he's a sweetheart. How many days? He probably has a talking gig on MSNBC and CNN. Honestly, he's definitely got podcasts, and he's right. The guy. Dude, the amount of texts that I get. Oh, this is David Hogg, the school shooting victim, or this is Jill Biden texting. Dude, right. I get them from Victor Lindemann now. Like, get off of my phone, Victor Lindemann. I don't need you. You are a political partisan, and you threw yourself in front of the political train, got yourself fired by sharing this, what I'm arguing is a frivolous complaint that the other side completely did, that you were part of because you worked on the administration, you were the ambassador. So
I'm going to argue it's not a frivolous complaint. I think it does rise to the level of what should be very concerning to a lot of Americans, right? So again, this comes back to this July 25th phone call where we have Donald Trump saying that the funding is going to be withheld unless you do unless we get an investigation going, right? So that's what stems from that, right? So the July 25th phone call, I think, is actually kind of hard to take into context without talking about the ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch, right? So she was the career ambassador under Obama to Ukraine, right? So she's been there for, I think, let me double check my numbers, something like 15 years. So she's a career diplomat. So now she's immediately highlighting a lot of these concerns that when the Trump administration comes in, right? So this is where it gets a little fishy, right? So there's this Naftogaz, right? So this is a gas supplier. So in March 2019, while Giuliani was pressing the Ukrainian administration to investigate the Bidens, a group of businessmen and Republican donors used their ties to Trump and Giuliani to try to replace the leadership of the Ukrainian state-owned oil and gas company Naftogaz, right? So this kind of ties into the fact that I would say that the Trump administration, it wasn't a matter of them trying to deal with corruption. They didn't like the people who told them that they couldn't do what they wanted to do, right? So we have on record Republican donors trying to unseat these people and take their positions. And then again, this could be a tit for tat, but it is really contingent on one person, being Donald Trump, then leveraging this to the order of, I'm withholding congressionally approved funds to Ukraine, which I don't want any president in the future to be able to do something like that.
I agree with you on that. I don't think that the president should withhold congressional funds. I understand that. What I would say is we were not in, of course, now we are involved in war between Russia and Ukraine. We were not at that time, right? Because it hadn't happened yet. They didn't move in, right, the tanks and all the troops. So what the heck are we providing funding for, first of all? Right? Does it need to be sent? And second of all, I think it's wild that, again, we've talked about this at length, how the Russia invasion is seen by that half of the world as a response to NATO aggression. So there's two things. Just this week, the long-term diplomat who had some say in Ukraine, I forget her name and I forget her position, but she was just resigned yesterday. And she was the one that was out there fomenting a color revolution to overthrow the last government and install the predecessor to Zelensky. It's like there's recordings of her talking about this plan. She was hosting a bake sale on the day of a massacre in one of their public squares. It's like, so to say that we're trying to change leadership and we're trying to overthrow this owner for that in a corporate sense, like, dude, we do that in their government. We overthrew their government, their duly elected government, to put our person in there. That's crazy. So we just added Sweden to NATO. That was my other point.
We empowered the people of Ukraine to overthrow their leader. So I want to be very, very clear. It was unanimous to remove the former president from there, who had proven ties to Russia and or taking a more favorable alignment. that it really was the Congress, the equivalent of their Congress, the legislature in Ukraine, that decided we want to align ourselves with the West. We want to align ourselves more with the Eurozone than we would, the Russia economic zone. I don't know what you'd ever call it. I guess BRICS, probably BRICS. And it really this comes down to a decision that those people made of their own accord, right? I argue that the Bill Clinton, impeachment trial is partisan, and because it fails, it diminishes the power of the process. Argue that, and I do want to get to a couple of key important timelines that I want to get to, it diminishes our ability to, say, impeach someone like Donald Trump, that I think it is. Because we feel that we shouldn't be in Ukraine, and probably rightfully so. When you start to look at the numbers, I'm not sure if we can afford it. To give Trump some credit, NATO should have been paying, its members should have been paying not maybe just 2%, but probably shooting for 2.5% or 3%. I think today's events, stress the importance of that. I would argue that if we don't have that partisan Bill Clinton impeachment process, we don't get a person like George W. Bush, who drags us into unnecessary wars, right? Like there had to be a response to the terror attacks, but surely a 22-year war hasn't really yielded much for us. At least over $1 trillion, 1 million dead, respectively, in each country, right? And then 50 to 60,000 dead Americans, right? I don't know if it was all
president for 8 years, so you got to blame Biden for a lot of those years as well.
And I blame the Obama administration for continuing, the war. He ran on a platform of pulling us out.
We thank the Trump administration for ending the war, right? And we also thank the Korean War went on much longer. Trump ended that one as well. So there's a lot of accomplishments here.
There's still plenty of artillery that's lined up at Seoul that could level the entire city within 40 minutes. So yes, while the war is over, I wouldn't say the hostilities have cooled off at all.
I just have to poke your buttons a little bit.
Of course. So I'm gonna blast through some key time points from the Trump impeachment trial that I think highlights the seriousness, in my opinion, of the phone call. Right. So we have the July 25th phone call with Zelensky. This immediately sets off the alarms of intelligence community officials whose job are to listen into these things, not only just for, to see what the president and how they're behaving ethically or not, but it is, just the general protections of recording all of these things for later analysis and then, picking intel from that, right? But this is where so this is where the whole alleged quid pro quo starts. There's months of campaigning by back channels to tell Ukraine that they want this investigation, but this is the big phone call where the president takes it, on his own and actually says the words that become so damning later, right? So now 3 days later, there's something called the Director of the National Intelligence, right? Community.
I know
Dan
who it
Coates.
is.
Yeah, it's Dan
wasn't
Coates.
Ratcliffe at that time?
No. So it's Dan Coates.
Okay.
And then his lieutenant, and again I forget the specific name, but the acting authority below him was Sue Gordon, right? So Dan Coates leaves on July 28th. Sue Gordon leaves on August 8th. This is right after this phone call on July 25th. They're obviously aware of what's going on because many of the community who put the evidence together for this whistleblower comment had already started reporting their concerns. And in the Trump administration, they immediately began clamping down on records and who was allowed at certain meetings and stuff like that. The gravity of the situation was apparent to a lot of people behind the scenes, right? Yeah. So now this whistleblower complaint is put together, right, on the 26th, August 26th. August 15th, we have someone named McGuire. He's the acting DNI who comes in under the Trump appointment, right?
I remember him, bald guy.
Yeah, exactly. So he was a career vice admiral, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the person who assesses the validity of this whistleblower comment, right? They take this information from the community, and they're the ones who make the assessment. They're known as the Inspector General of the intelligence community, right? Yeah. So I don't want to butcher his name, so I'm not going to say it right now. Michael Kevin Atkinson, right? So he's the Inspector General. Now, Michael Kevin Atkinson is clearly a bipartisan prosecutor. Some of his most significant convictions are two Democrats, right? So for let me pull up the numbers. There was William J. Jefferson of Louisiana for finding out that he took over $400,000 in bribes from foreign dignitaries for preferential treatment for defense contracting. So I did a great job of finding a very corrupt Democrat. And then there was another Democrat by the name of Vincent Gregg, I believe his name is, but Vincent Gary, I'm sorry. So he was a DC mayor, and while he didn't get a conviction on him specifically, there were 7 members in his campaign that were charged for irregularities due to campaign financing and spending and things like that. So this guy has a career, 15 years of being very bipartisan and prosecuting Democrats. He makes the ultimate call to push it to the DNI and determine that this whistleblower comment is credible. And now the legal structure is that it is not the responsibility of the DNI to make that decision or that assessment. It is solely of the Inspector General to make that decision. In fact, their job is just messenger boy. They're supposed to just hand it directly on to the Justice Department, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really, really questionable, right? So now that they have this report on August 26th, September 2nd.
Jeff Sessions, right? Not Bill Barr yet?
Yeah, Jeff Sessions, yep. So September 2nd rolls around. This is the deadline for when the DNI is required to report this to Congress and the Justice Department. They need to become fully aware of this, right? That doesn't happen. On September 9th, 7 days later, this is Michael Atkinson, the Inspector General. He takes it of his own accord and reports it directly to Congress. That's how this all blows up. That's how you get Democrat Adam Schiff to latch onto this, because he's on the House Intelligence Committee, right?
Yeah.
So this is where he brings this stuff up. And like I said, it's very, very questionable to why the DNI would withhold this information from Congress when they're legally compelled to do so. And around this time, September 27th, the regular communications recording system that takes transcripts of everything the president says, they move all the records from that system to a highly classified system to where state secrets are held. So again, this is unprecedented. No president before has moved the transcript records to this high level classification, and
Right.
not just the Zelensky phone call, but all of his calls to to foreign dignitaries.
Yeah. Well, hey, I mean, I would imagine if I sit in the president's seat, I'd be wanting to be chummy with these world leaders, and I'd want to, build rapport and be conversational. I wouldn't necessarily want to be all business or adversarial or act like what I would envision maybe a DeSantis character would do if he's sitting in office. I'd want to be more like the Trump figure in that way, in that it's just more honest, more authentic. I really think that creates a better result.
So I respect privilege. Absolutely, the president needs to be able to conduct diplomacy, and that's
Absolutely,
often through realpolitik, right? Like saying things that your base would never support, but you have to say these things behind closed doors because it's really the right thing to do, for the situation. Winston Churchill was quoted as saying, "In times of war, you have to guard the truth with a bodyguard of lies," right? Like. That's how precious it is, right? So, like, the truth could be so damning in a war effort. And again, this is not to promote the government lying to its people, especially during a time of war, but I can appreciate how important, information flow is when you're trying to, navigate a situation. However, we have these procedures in place that allow us to then check the executive's power, right? We have these records, so then a whistleblower comment can come forth, and we could make an investigation of it the same way we can investigate Biden and the Hunter Biden dealings and these payments and stuff like that. We got to be able to have these processes that allow external forces to be able to come in and collect evidence and see what's going on.
Don't you think that if a Trump impeachment had gone through at the middle of his first term, or I guess 3/4 of the way through, don't you think that if that had happened, there would have been even more disarray and even more changing of, to Pence and firing of leaving of the, cabinet members and all this stuff? I almost feel like it would end up being more disruptive if an impeachment were to ever even happen,
So that's always weighing the balance, right?
Yeah.
It's a highly political process. That was the concern with the Andrew Johnson impeachment, actually, the Reconstruction era after Civil War.
Yeah.
That impeachment was, regarded as highly political. But what was also known as ushering in an era of congressional power, right? So it diminished the executive's role quite a bit, and it was an era when culturally we relied on legislative efforts to get things done, right? So that was certainly some element there of that political process that you're always thinking, what does this do, right? Like, even if we don't succeed, how does this damage the process? So to just go off into hypotheticals, I would argue if Trump is successfully impeached on the first trial, in the first impeachment trial regarding the Zelensky phone call, I think that the Republicans lose to maybe not Biden, because many people will argue that the Democrats put forth Biden because he was an extension of Obama's platforms and legacy and stuff like that, and was the only person duly positioned, right? Because on paper, as a Democrat, I mean, I had many problems with Hillary Clinton, but it was a no-brainer. I mean, to me, she just seemed as a much better candidate, and yet I wake up the morning after to find that she didn't win, right? So Democrats kind of go into like crisis mode, and they say we need to do a post-mortem analysis of what happened with this election, right? And they come back stronger. I think that's ironic to say that Biden is the stronger candidate again. But I would argue that if the Republicans lose the next election because Trump is impeached, they come back with a vigorous, strong candidate. And I would say that the Democrats are in a position, they're terrified right now, right? Because the Republicans are to come back with a virile, less controversial, more electable candidate, Yeah. Defeat teaches us way more than it ever does victory. And I'd say the worst thing that's been happening to the Republican Party for so many years is, through gerrymandering or just general, genuine successful election efforts, they're not being challenged enough, and it ties back to a lot of these social issues kind of infecting the party, where there's people like me who many of the time would vote, not over a Democrat, but vote for a Republican if it makes sense on certain issues, and it just brings balance to the stage. Will Hurd, 2024.
I don't even know who that is, to be honest.
Nobody does. He was way too qualified. That's why.
Fair
that
enough.
does you no good anymore.
I mean, listen, this failure of a system, it reminds me of what, maybe we'll talk about it next week because I think we're running out of time here, but the 14th Amendment, right? Everyone in the media kind of read Section 3. If you engaged in insurrection, you can't run. But the people who read you Section 3, they never made it Section 5. Only Congress may enforce this. So that's what the Supreme Court just told us. A simple reading of the Supreme Court ruling 9-0 would say, Trump didn't engage in insurrection. But they didn't find that. They found that a state cannot remove him, and it's Congress that would impart the 14th Amendment, not a Secretary of State in Maine or in Colorado.
Very, very, very clear ruling, so there's no questions there. And then, like you said, it's a matter of the Supreme Court, so it's up to people if they want to change those rules. But I don't know how you do that without a federal, change, right? An amendment of some kind.
Well, hopefully our legislator will take a hint, learn how to legislate, because I do think that as we, it's funny. We started this show and we wanted to debate, right? But we actually literally agree on almost everything, and then we share the nuances of each other's side. And we actually agree more after that. So why can't our freaking Congress do this? And the answer is that, well, what we talk about, they're paid to filibuster, and they're not paid by the taxpayer. They're paid by the corporations, because actually that's another thing. Just going to throw this out. 170,000 for these Congress people, that's like not a lot. That's not enough to live, to maintain two households, fly between places, work.
No, so there's a funny argument to raise their wages. Yeah. I mean, we look at some countries that have very high wages for their presidency, and it's a single term. So, and I think it's Singapore, and they say, we want our president to be just like the chief executive of a company. We want him well compensated, so there's no worry about undue influence or concerns about them having to, how do I, use this to springboard into either lobbying or media, post campaign and stuff like that, right? Like they're supposed to be well compensated, and then they're focused on just that one term because that's all they have,
I mean, or you could be so morally straight and narrow, like Donald Trump, and only take a $1 salary from the American people, because you don't want to, you don't want to rape the American people like that. You want to only take what you need, that's $1.
There's no need when you make Secret Service stay at Trump hotels and you're getting paid on the back end.
Okay, so I'm not going to let it happen. They paid back the money from the hotels. Whenever the hotels were used for official business, they paid back the Treasury Department. It was $8 million.
All right, if that's
$8 million for the Trump organization
if that's the
is
case,
like, If you're Elon Musk and you're walking down the street and you're worth 300 billion, do you know how much you have to walk over to make it make sense, right? You and me, we might pick up a
absolutely.
quarter or a dollar bill. Elon Musk would have to walk over a pile of $400,000 for it to make sense for 1 second of effort. So Donald Trump is similar. I mean, maybe not as rich, but he can't be bothered to talk about $8 million. Give the $8 million away. We're going to talk about something else now. It's just fake. It's just so BS.
That's fair. So I had not learned that he had returned it, and thankfully so, because like I said, I think it would leave an undue precedent, but I always give credit where credit is due. If that's the case, then that's a very fair thing to do.
I didn't see the check. I didn't see the canceled check, but I will say that Eric Trump heard this
headline,
right? And he's like, listen, I'm in charge. This is BS. We gave it back. So what are you going to say next? So, hey, Mike, thank you. We covered everything. Guys, if you're watching this video, if you've made it now to an hour and 15 minutes in, please, you better subscribe. This is crazy if you don't subscribe yet. Mike still isn't on Twitter. I still am, and I'm not on Reddit. So he's taking up that left side contingency, and I'm hiding up the right. So please subscribe. Mike, thank you very much. Try not to get eaten up by DeSantis and his sycophants down there in Florida. And I'm going to try to avoid all of the election interference happening up here in Connecticut. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for having me. Always look forward to it. And again, if you like our stuff, man, give us feedback and comments. We love what we're receiving so far, and it just makes a greater show each week for you. So tell all your friends.
Yes. And also, we talk about a lot of topics. So put the topics you want to hear. You know, if there's certain areas of history, we know a lot about history, but we go out of our way to study it even more to do this stuff. So if there's something, you know, we did a little bit deep dive into the Cold War, maybe we got to go back a little further, maybe not. Maybe we focus on Iraq War and a little bit of nuances there. But Mike, as always, we've found common ground. We've elevated our thoughts, and this has been Left versus Right.